Imagine living in constant fear, knowing you could be torn from your life and sold into a lifetime of cruel slavery by a kidnapping network. You've probably heard of the Underground Railroad, that heroic network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. But what you haven't heard, what's rarely taught in schools, is the dark counterpart to this story, the reverse Underground Railroad. Today we're uncovering this hidden and horrifying chapter of American history, a tale of greed, deception, and lives destroyed. This is not a story of liberation, it's one of betrayal and suffering that many don't even know existed. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe so you don't miss out on these forgotten stories. Let's get into details. Before I talk about the reverse Underground Railroad, I want to talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad, and it wasn't underground. It was a secret network of people and safe places that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North and Canada. Between 1810 and 1850, it's believed that about 100,000 enslaved people found freedom through this network. Escaping slavery was dangerous. Patrols searched for runaways, ready to drag them back. But those seeking freedom had help. If they saw a lantern in a window, it meant safety. Homes, barns, churches, and even businesses became hiding places along the way. The Underground Railroad wasn't an official organization, it was a movement. People who believed slavery was wrong risked their own safety to help. Free black people, formerly enslaved people, and white abolitionists worked together, guiding escapees from one safe house to another. To keep the network hidden, people used railroad terms as code words. Runaways were called passengers. Safe houses were stations. The brave people who guided them were conductors, and those who sheltered them were station masters. Many conductors, including former enslaved people, disguised themselves and sneaked others out of plantations. Most escapees traveled north, but some went to Mexico or Caribbean islands where slavery was illegal. The journey was long and dangerous, sometimes traveling on foot for 10 to 20 miles between safe houses, often only at night. During the Civil War, many freedom seekers ran toward Union Army camps to escape slavery for good. But here is something you should know: although many people in the North supported the Underground Railroad, not everyone approved of helping escaped slaves. This is where the story of reverse Underground Railroad begins. The reverse Underground Railroad was created out of greed and anger over escaped slaves finding freedom. Unlike the Underground Railroad, which helped people escape slavery, this secret network did the opposite. It kidnapped free black people and sold them into slavery in the South. Before the Civil War, both runaway slaves and free black individuals were captured and sold, often many times over. There were even rewards for catching and returning escapees. Kidnappers used three main tactics. 1. Physical force, simply grabbing people and taking them. 2. Deception, tricking free black individuals into going with them. 3. False claims, accusing free black people of being escaped slaves and selling them. This horrifying practice lasted from 1780 to 1865. The term reverse Underground Railroad came from those angry that an underground network existed to help slaves escape. Kidnappers targeted free black people in border states like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. But even in northern states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, kidnappings were common. Cities like New York and Philadelphia were especially dangerous, with gangs like the Blackbirders preying on men, women, and children, sometimes with help from corrupt police and officials. Black newspapers often published missing children notices, including one about the 14-year-old daughter of a newspaper editor. Children were especially vulnerable to kidnappers. In Philadelphia alone, at least dozens disappeared between 1811 and 1829. One of the most notorious kidnappers was Martha Patty Cannon, a ruthless slave trader and serial killer. She led the Cannon-Johnson Gang, a multiracial group operating across Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. For about a decade in the early 1800s, they abducted hundreds of free black people and escaped slaves, selling them to plantation owners in the Deep South, including Alabama and Mississippi. Patty Cannon was eventually arrested in 1829, charged with 4 murders, and died in prison, allegedly by poisoning herself with arsenic. According to historian Richard Bell, the rise of this brutal kidnapping network was fueled by a major law passed in 1808, which banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean. This hit Deep South states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama hard because they relied on enslaved labor for cotton production. With the supply of enslaved workers shrinking and legal purchases becoming too expensive, many plantation owners turned to illegal methods, kidnapping free black people from northern states and selling them in the South. Between 1808 and the Civil War, tens of thousands of free black individuals were kidnapped, never to be seen again by their families. The demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed, with prices rising dramatically. A person who might be sold for $300 in Virginia could fetch up to $1,200 in the Deep South. This made the trade so profitable that even southern states sold enslaved people to one another, fueling a horrifying cycle of human trafficking. Like the Underground Railroad, the reverse Underground Railroad was a secret network, but it served a sinister purpose, enslaving people instead of freeing them. Hundreds of people were trafficked each year, just as many as were escaping via the Underground Railroad. However, while abolitionists worked tirelessly to help the enslaved find freedom, these kidnappers thrived on greed and cruelty. Unlike the Underground Railroad, there is little historical documentation on the reverse Underground Railroad. Corruption, bribery, and indifference allowed kidnappers to operate unchecked. Police often looked the other way, and many white citizens simply didn't care. Tragically, the most common victims were poor, illiterate, and homeless children, both boys and girls, who had no one to protect them. Philadelphia was a prime target for kidnappers due to its proximity to southern slave states. Many kidnapped individuals were forced to walk extreme distances, often being sold off one by one along the route. Unlike official slave auctions, which kept detailed sale records, very little documentation exists for these kidnappings, making it difficult to trace what happened to most victims. During the pre-Civil War period, child abductions were especially common, and black freedom remained fragile. Even free black individuals were never truly safe. In addition to capturing free black people from the North, traffickers on the reverse Underground Railroad also focused on recapturing escaped slaves. Many kidnappers used deception rather than outright force, luring victims into captivity through false promises or trickery. Though not as meticulously planned as the Underground Railroad, the reverse Underground Railroad had its own network of routes, safe houses, and forged documents to aid in transporting kidnapped individuals. If stopped, kidnappers often produced fake bills of sale to justify why they were traveling with black men, women, or children. Common routes included brief stops in hidden basements or secluded properties before moving captives onto boats traveling through the waters of Maryland and Delaware. These water routes could take a week or longer, after which victims were handed over to slave owners or other traffickers, eventually being moved even deeper into the South.
The journée to the South was brutal and deadly.
Being kidnapped was just the beginning of the nightmare. Once captured, victims endured horrific travel conditions. Some were shackled in windowless rooms on ships that felt like floating dungeons, while others were forced to march over 1,000 miles on foot. Along the way, those who complained or walked too slowly were often whipped, and many died from exhaustion, frostbite, or disease before ever reaching their final destination. Despite the sheer scale of these kidnappings, little was done to stop them. Kidnappers were rarely caught, and even when they were, punishment was rare. With no reliable way to gather victim testimonies, many traffickers simply changed their names or relocated to continue their operations elsewhere. News of these crimes spread slowly, leaving many people unaware of the risks lurking around them. According to research published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, well-organized kidnapping rings made it nearly impossible to track or stop traffickers, as victims were moved south too quickly for authorities to intervene. Though many kidnappers operated in secrecy, Some became infamous for their cruel tactics, relentless brutality, or sheer number of victims, cementing their place in history as some of the most ruthless figures of the reverse Underground Railroad. Paddy Cannon and the Cannon-Johnson Gang were well-known kidnappers in Delaware and Maryland, capturing and selling hundreds of free black people into slavery. A historical marker near the Delaware-Maryland border states that Cannon's former slave, Cyrus James, told the court he saw her kill several people, including a black woman's child. While most of her gang escaped, Cannon was caught but died in jail before her trial. The reverse Underground Railroad is a sad part of history. While the Underground Railroad helped enslaved people escape to freedom, the reverse Underground Railroad did the opposite, stealing freedom from those who had it. It reminds us to stand against injustice and never let the complete history be forgotten. Did you learn something new? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to hit that like button, share with your friends and family, and subscribe to stay updated with more content. Thanks for watching.